Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Back in Paris for a few seconds. Welcome back to this session on the state of the art of photovoltaic development. And I will give the floor to Andreas Bett. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andreas Bett, and I'm director of Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy System here in Freiburg. It's my pleasure to chair the session here, State of the Art of Photovoltaic Deployment. I had actually the honor in 2009 to receive the Becquerel Prize for my work in the multi-junction solar cell way back using the 3.5 materials. So we have heard already in the session before that tandems and multi-junction solar cell become now much more interesting, also on silicon material, but also on thin film. And then we heard from Christoph Balev already an impressive talk how we can proceed and that we still have a lot of things to do in photovoltaics for new applications, since we are already fairly cheap in producing the solar cells. And now we come to the most important part, which triggers at the end also the research. And I think one of the results of the low cost is the deployment. And I'm very pleased to introduce now Gaëtan Masson from the Institute Becquerel in Brussels. He will speak in French, as he just mentioned. He is also active in the AGRI-PV. And I have here in my list a general overview, which is relatively generic, but I see here on the screen already another title. So Gaëtan, the floor is yours. Please give your presentation. Gaëtan, you must switch on your mic.
It should be fine now.
So can you go to the presentation mode? Is this possible?
Full screen?
Yes, perfect.
Do you see it?
Yes, perfect.
Thanks, Andreas. I will switch to French now.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I have to say that speaking after Christophe Bali is quite a challenge. He's a tough act to follow. I'm going to discuss the same thing, but I'm going to try and put a different spin on it. So I changed the picture of Edmond Becquerel. I try to make it funner. We are a consulting company based in Brussels. We specialize in developing PV. I'm not going to talk about that. Let me talk about the rest. There's something always interesting when we discuss the Becquerel family. At the end of the day, back in 1839, Edmond Becquerel discovered the photovoltaic effect, and his son will actually be rewarded, will get an even higher distinction, the Nobel Prize for discovering spontaneous radioactivity alongside Pierre-Emmanuel Curie. But I tend to say that in general, that the son won the battle, but we will soon get back to the father's activity because the son built on the shoulders of his own father. So nuclear development was very quick in the 60s and in the 70s, and then reached a plateau in the 90s. But if we look at wind and PV, we see a significantly faster growth curve. Now, it's always hard to compare a renewable source with nuclear because nuclear people have always had a lot of money to even convince the most famous actresses to adopt atomic names. But we don't have solar stars. But we do have a sun king in France. And I do believe that the sun is now the king of all energy sources. So we decided to call PV the Sun King. I don't know whether it's because they're based in Paris, but I'm sure that it'll be the talk of the day in the next few years. So I love revolutions, and I love energy revolutions even more. And an energy revolution should be a little less violent than a traditional revolution, but it does have a number of collateral damage. It's going to kill a lot of technologies. It's done it already. A lot of technologies are now dead. And also politicians are very surprised by how quickly PV has grown in recent years. This has nothing to do with what we consider normal in the world of energy. PV is so important now and has become so important over the past 10 years that it's a force to be reckoned with. You can't push into the rug anymore, but mindsets haven't adapted accordingly. Also, a number of energy players have taken a while before they understood what was actually going on. I like this picture. We took it in early 2009 and we showed it on Facebook. What has changed in just 10 years? Well, let me tell you what has changed. Mass growth in PV from 14.5 gigawatts at the end of 2008 until over 500 gigawatts at the end of 2018. And probably this year will be closer to 750 gigawatt in terms of installed capacity. So things are growing really quickly. At some point in time, people need to realize that. So looking at what's happening around the world in more detail. By and large, over 110 gigawatt was installed last year. These are the figures from the PV program of the International Energy Agency. So things are moving really quickly in a number of countries outside of Europe in particular, including in the US and Japan, India, and African countries, Southeast Asia as well, and in the EU as well, obviously. But where are we headed? If we base ourselves on the current discussions in the current PV community, we're talking 200 gigawatt within 2-3 years, maybe even 300 gigawatt by 2025, maybe 1 terawatt in install capacity every year starting 2030, maybe even more. So one thing is sure, considering how competitive PV is, we'll get back to it. There's a true revolution going on, and this revolution cannot be stopped. So talking about PV, photovoltaics, let's spend a minute on this. We may not be talking about the same thing. Depending on where we are or how we talk about it, we may be discussing different things, whether it's a PV roof on someone's house or a major PV farm, etc. The technology is similar, but we're starting to see distinctions. And what we're seeing is that on top of the major earth-based, ground-based PV installations or distributed roof PV panels, we're starting to see other options that are emerging. So it's not because this guy is German, but I think it's funny. This gentleman, who will go unnamed, was the CEO of RWE, the French equivalent of EDF. Pardon me, the German equivalent of EDF. And he used to say that producing electricity from solar in Germany is like growing pineapples in Alaska. So I checked. Number one, you can grow pineapples in Alaska. And second, PV is now competitive. So what he used to say 9 years ago is turning out to be completely wrong. And the guy was fired, by the way. So it's okay to have a sense of humor, but if you say something stupid, eventually reality will catch up with you. So PV is competitive. Yes, it is in a lot of different regions across the world. So let me show you a couple of examples of countries where there were calls for tender and the price tag at the end of the call for tender was extremely low. Well, let me focus on Qatar. By and large, we're talking US dollars here, okay? So 1.4 euro centimes per kilowatt hour. That's the price. The price is so low that very probably in future years it's going to be very difficult to find any new source of energy that can compete with PV. And this is true for Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Chile, all of these countries around the world. But also in Europe as well. We're starting to see very competitive prices. It's not that hard, really. Just do the math. Production cost per kilowatt hour using PV based on market prices. This study was done in 2018. In 2020, there were a lot of changes, temporary changes due to the COVID pandemic. So this is why we're basing ourselves on 2018 prices. So already in 2018, the cost of 1 kilowatt hour using PV is lower than the average market price in blue. I'm not saying that PV is entirely competitive, but what I'm saying is that for large ground-based facilities, using current market prices, it's possible to produce PV energy competitively relative to other sources of energy. So there was a call for tender recently in Portugal, and the bottom price was crazy competitive. It's not 1.3, it's actually 1.1 euro centimes per kilowatt hour. At this time, it's impossible to do that using different other methods in Portugal. And this means that a number of players are starting to think that you have to join the bandwagon. You need to reserve network connections because we're faced with a massive ramp up in PV. Because as long as PV is competitive relative to average market prices, it's going to be very difficult to fight this trend. So Breyer's study in Finland has already been referred to by Christophe Bailly and other speakers. What's really interesting about this study is that it shows that by 2050, if we base ourselves solely on the change in competitiveness of all energy sources, photovoltaic could account for 69% of the total energy demand, not just electricity. So of course, electrification of transport, of buildings, of a number of industry processes. Yes, yes, yes. But the underlying conclusion is this: not only PV is already or will become the most competitive source of energy in the world, but it's hard to see what could stop it. And because there are so few obstacles, by definition, PV will become the most widespread and the most competitive source of energy in the world before 2050. Of course, this will need virtual production facilities that will aggregate different sources of energy, wind, biomass, hydraulics, etc., plus active demand management, active storage management. This will also mean, and I can talk about this all day, mean discussing renewable energy communities. In other words, bringing together power generation and power consumption in the same place. Is it possible to produce PV electricity on my roof and use my own electricity to power up my car, which is in the office's parking lot a few kilometers away? The future will tell. And obviously, this is the same picture that Christophe Bailly showed you earlier, so I'll skip that subject. So how do we integrate PV solar panels into new builds? It's possible thanks to new and more competitive prices, as well as new business models. So via PV. So PV integrated into electric vehicles. This means reducing the number of times you need to charge up your vehicles, making sure it lasts longer. So high efficiency PV. And we're going to see more and more electric vehicles using PV on roads and streets in the future. So future developments: floating PV, offshore floating PV farms. So this is an interesting area of research in terms of longevity and power extraction. Apologies for coughing. Now, using PV in combination with agriculture, you develop new business models for agriculture, for farming, but also new business models for PV without having the two compete with each other, power generation on the one hand, agriculture on the other. So calls for tender, €1 per kilowatt hour. This means producing green energy because we're using low carbon or zero carbon energy sources. Now, we're not entirely competitive, but we will be by 2025. And this raises a number of possibilities in terms of reducing the carbon footprint of heavy transport, aviation, etc. And I will end on this. I think it's important to have a long-term vision of things. PV is becoming the cheapest source of energy, of electricity around the world. So it's here to stay and is bound to grow. And I think the only way to move forward is to understand and adapt all of the existing legislation frameworks. And we'll end on this. In order to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040, which is the deadline for sticking to the 1.5 degree global temperature increase scenario, by and large, we will need to accelerate our efforts to decarbonate. Now, the latest figures show that PV saved as much as 720 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And this was true at the end of 2019. In other words, by 2021, 2022, this means CO2 savings close to 1 gigaton. So we have a long way to go until PV can make a really significant contribution to reducing CO2 emissions. But of course, we are on the right track, and I would like to end on this positive note. This is probably the next step in human evolution, photovoltaic. Thank you.
Gaëtan, thank you very much for this presentation, which certainly highlights again that we are in photovoltaics now on a cheap side and no more on the more expensive side. We do not need to defend ourselves on this part. And you showed also that we have the great opportunities if we bring in photovoltaics in integration in whatever kind. So I ask for questions or comments. Maybe someone can translate it from, because I cannot understand fully in French. I understand roughly, but maybe someone can ask the questions.
So I can translate for you. Which question do you want to ask?
Let's take the last one.
Okay, so a question for Gaëtan. What can we think about the fact that some of the politicians, especially in France, say that photovoltaic is not reliable and expensive?
Should I answer in French or in English?
Français?
Je vais répondre en français. Alors, je crois qu'il y a un manque de compréhension.
I think this is a misunderstanding. It's a widespread misunderstanding. It's not just among politicians. They misunderstand the rate at which, the speed at which photovoltaics grow. Prices are extremely low at the moment and will continue to be low in the coming years. Another question has to do with reliability of PV. By and large, this problem has been resolved. There were problems 10 years ago or so. This was true in France and in other countries because the industry was relatively young. But the quality level today is very reasonable and matches investors' requirements by and large.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to put a question to Gaëtan. Gaëtan, you know me. Let me play devil's advocate. In your opinion, who are the two key obstacles to the growth of photovoltaic? I'm not talking about science or technology or cost. I'd like your opinion on this. To my mind, the two main obstacles are, number one, the grid. Huge investments are necessary into the grid in order to adjust it, adapt it. Intermittence is key as well. So investments must be made into the grid, and they're not being made in Europe except for maybe Denmark or Germany. And they're investing into wind, and that's not true in the US. The grid is in the US is highly compartmentalized. But the second obstacle to my mind is the market itself, as you said. Now, for various business reasons, and this is true also for people who will sell renewable energy to us, they too want to set up a meter between us and the sun. And to my mind, this is going to hamper growth of BIPVs. Well, your question contains a lot of sub-questions. Thank you for that. But the first sub-question is the most interesting one to my mind. What is it that blocks development of PV? First of all, constant changes in legislation. I'm not talking about France per se, but it's hard for people to understand what is actually going on when they have a PV installation. We've seen this happen in a lot of countries, repeated legislative changes, sometimes every 6 months, and also in terms of how much money you can make off these installations. This is interesting in France, profitability of PV facilities. Things have changed so much, and they've backtracked on legislation that has been around for 10 years. And also there are a number of players that don't want PV to succeed, and they are spreading fake news. So we're living in an alternative world these days, and there's a lot of fake news traveling around freely. And generally speaking, this is the main obstacle to the growth of PV. It's not competitiveness, lack thereof. It's not the quality of the facilities. No, it's misinformation about what PV is all about. Could you please remind me what your second question was? Handing over to my colleague now.
Now, autonomy of buildings. I think, generally speaking, it's just a question of regulations. It has to do with regulation. I wouldn't put major power stations against powered buildings, but I would say to associate the two different ways of generating electricity, well, it requires regulations. Now, in Germany, there's going to be less installations in France than in Germany. It's really a question of regulatory measures. So to answer your question concerning the network aspect, there will be investments that will be necessary for the distribution network. It isn't only that caused by PV, it's because of energy transition to go from heat pumps to electric heating is going to change requirements for the grid. Now, through the development of PV, I think there's a real public investment that has to be made for the grid, generally speaking, for all the renewables, not just PV.
Okay, Gaëtan, thank you very much.